How you folks doing? Actually, I think I'm supposed to say, how y'all doing? All right, great. Man, that's a big screen. Hi, my name is Dave McClure. I'm a hillbilly VC. I was born in West Virginia. I'm going to try and keep you guys enthused for half an hour or so. We'll see, maybe a little bit longer. I've been a geek. I've been an entrepreneur, not a great one. I've been an investor. I've been a lot of other shit. Excuse my French or profanity. I blame my mother. You can write to her if you have a problem with this crap. Anyway, I've been in Silicon Valley for a bunch of time, but let me tell you the story this way. I was born in Morgantown. How many people ever been to a Mountaineer game? Yeah, I'm sorry we beat your ass a couple times, but you know. Anyway, I grew up in Morgantown, a little bit in Columbia, Maryland. My dad and a lot of family still live in West Virginia. My mom lives in Deep Creek out in Maryland. I went to school at Hopkins for a little while. Actually got there, oh yeah, really? Yeah, okay. Got there a couple years early, ended up graduating on time. You can figure out the math on that. Supposed to be a class of 86 or 87, didn't quite there. And then I headed out to California in 1989, just in time for an earthquake. I'm kind of an old dude, actually. I'm over 50 now. I started out as a software developer and did that for a few years. Did some consulting. That kind of turned into my first startup where I made a ton of mistakes. We ended up getting a very small exit out of that was less than $1 million. And I always tell people, you know, experience is what you get when you don't get what you want, and I've got a fuckload of experience. I ended up making a little bit of money with that. Took about a year off to play around. Actually, it was about 3 years overdue on a honeymoon with my wife, and kind of bounced around a little bit. Ended up at PayPal in 2001. I'm skipping over the first .com crash, which happened around 2001. But got to work with some really amazing folks at PayPal, Peter Thiel and Reid Hoffman and Max Levchin and a bunch of other folks. Made a little bit of money on that IPO and started doing some investing. Was an angel investor for probably 4 years in a bunch of companies. I was also doing a lot of writing and blogging and eventually, you know, Facebook and Twitter and all kinds of stuff that came out in kind of that, you know, 2004, 5, 6 timeframe. Gradually started getting into venture capital. I worked with Peter Thiel again and Sean Parker at Founders Fund for a little bit, and then got 500 startups off the ground in 2010 with my partner Christine Tsai. So what is 500 startups? We're floor wax and a dessert topping. For those of you who are over 50 and SNL fans, you'll get that joke. We are a venture capital firm. We've raised about $300 million, a little bit more than that. We've invested in a lot of companies, so actually quite a bit more than 500, now close to 1,800. We started with about 5 people, but we're now 150 people, and a third of those are outside the U.S., spread across 20 or so countries. And about a third of our investments are actually outside the U.S. in about 60 different countries. We make a lot of bets, and a lot of them are wrong, but occasionally we get it right. We've invested in 3 companies that are unicorn billion-dollar companies, probably about 30 or 40 that are $100 million plus companies. Probably at least 500 companies that are dead. 500 dead startups was a name we did consider. So what do we do? Well, we invest early, kind of like an angel investor. We typically write $100,000 checks or sometimes less. We might write up to a $500,000 check, but not much more than that. We run an accelerator program that might be similar to ones you've heard of from Y Combinator or Techstars or others that might be more local here in the area. We also invest at seed stage along with other smaller seed funds and venture capitalists, and sometimes we invest at Series A or later with some bigger folks. One of the things that's kind of different about 500 is, typical VCs usually will invest in maybe 20 to 40 companies per portfolio. Most venture capitalists themselves will do 1 or 2 investments per year. Our first fund was 270 companies. That was mostly just me and Christine. We were doing about 40 or 50 companies per person per year. We've sort of slowed down a little bit. Now we're doing only maybe 20 companies a year, but we have about 30 or 40 people doing that. This is a slide that's got a bunch of sports up there, and I'm here to make a bunch of bad sports analogies. I will say that all those teams up there that I've listed are, San Francisco Bay Area, so football, West Coast Offense, baseball, Moneyball, the Oakland A's, and basketball, your 2017 world champion by the fucking way, the Golden State Warriors. There's some dude out in Cleveland who thinks he's going to get there. I don't think he's going to get to the finals, but whatever. Now, all three of those sports have been around for a long time. And yet all three sports went through major revolutions in the last 10 to 20 years. So football in the 80s, baseball maybe just 10 years ago, and then basketball really in just the last 3 to 5 years. Now, how is it possible that you have sports that have been around for almost 100 or more than 100 years, and yet major revolutions in strategy happened just recently? I don't think that's because people are not gathering statistics or not paying attention. I think it's because they're just set in their ways, and they don't really see a new way of doing things until somebody really goes at it for a while. And actually, a lot of those innovations didn't happen overnight. They took 10 or 20 years. Paul Westphal and a lot of the basketball revolution took a while. That three-point revolution started happening 15, 20 years ago. It didn't really come into force just until recently. And now I'll segue into why I'm the next greatest thoughtful person in venture capital. So we think that there's a different way to do investments, and we think that's by making a lot of bets, a lot of little bets. And I'll explain a little bit why we think that is. Along the way, over the last 20 years, there's been a couple of major changes in how software companies get built. The main thing is we can spend a lot less money in the first couple of years, but also there's a bunch of other things. There's a lot more people online. There's a lot of ways to distribute your products and services through online platforms, search and social and media. But in general, let's say 20 years ago in Silicon Valley, I came out there in '89 or so. A lot of companies would raise money from angel investors, but they would still raise a good bit of money from venture capitalists before they even got their product to market. So they might raise $5 to $10 million, spend a couple of years building product, spend another couple of years scaling their sales force. They might raise $10 million or more before they even get to market. And their audiences were not that big. It was mostly business customers. To the extent it was consumers, it was probably less than 100 million people that were online, at least around that time. Now, I can tell you I was in Silicon Valley, and people were very excited about doing this. They were very excited in the mid-'90s and in the late '90s. A lot of the companies being built at that time were actually not very sustainable, and in fact, I would argue that they were kind of crappy companies that were built for venture capitalists to make money, but not really for the market to make money. And that's kind of why we had that big crash in 2000, 2001. It's those companies, with a few exceptions, were mostly not really companies based on profits. In many cases, they weren't even based on revenue. They were just great stories. Now, there were folks like eBay and Amazon and Google and a few others that got started there that were really big stories. But a lot of those companies that went public in the late -- were shams, and ended up a lot of small investors, retail investors, people that bought in the IPOs lost a lot of money as a result of that. But I will say what's interesting now, 20 or so years later, it doesn't cost that much money to build startups. Really, maybe a lot of sweat equity, maybe a couple $100,000 in the first year, enough to pay rent. Sometimes if you're in your parents' basement or in a garage, you don't even have to do that. But really not much money, more than say a couple $100,000 to $1 million in those first 2 years. Now, after that, definitely people will put a lot more money into those companies if they're working and scaling. But what's interesting is that people were really excited about spending a couple years and a bunch of $10, $20 million to get products off the ground 20 years ago. It's much better now. We have a lot more capital, a lot more people online, a lot more infrastructure systems that exist out there for us to build on. Amazon, Google, PayPal, a couple of companies we've invested in called Twilio and SendGrid. So it's really a pretty amazing time. As an entrepreneur, you don't really need that much capital, and you can build products that reach hundreds of millions of people, and in some cases, billions of people. The other thing I mentioned is that it's easier to reach those people. A lot of the products and services here maybe took 5 to 10 years to build, but the ones to your far right on that screen, a lot of the visual platforms and a lot of the messaging platforms, those are products that are less than 5 years old, in some cases just a few years old, with hundreds of millions, in a few cases billions of customers or users. And so what's really amazing is the ability for us as entrepreneurs to build products which don't cost that much capital and touch millions, if not hundreds of millions, and in some cases even billions of people around the world. That's an amazing opportunity. And I'm not here to make light of that. That's really, really awesome and amazing. But we still have a lot of failures. So even though the cost of building startups in the first few years is cheaper, and the ability to reach millions of people is much, much easier, we still fail probably 50 to 80% of the time, at least in building a sustainable company, and even smaller than that, building a large company. When we did our first fund, we invested in about 250, 270 companies or so. We expected about 50, even up to 80% of them to fail or not return capital to us. We were really expecting we would see some positive wins from 20% of those companies, and maybe we would see some big wins from 5% of those companies. Now, actually, when I present this now and we're talking about our current portfolio, we even start saying, hey, we have a 1 to 2% chance of finding billion-dollar outcomes, or at least 50 to 100x outcomes, the unicorn company. Now, we know that because we started to see it. We didn't actually see that when we first started. But I had done angel investments, and I knew most of my angel investments failed, but a few of them actually worked. So this was kind of our original thesis. Now, if you look at the industry stats on how many companies actually get to billion-dollar outcomes from Series A, from when companies raise maybe 3 to 5 up to $10 million, the average venture capitalist picks a unicorn about 1% of the time. That does not sound very successful. It doesn't sound very amazing. And in fact, if you remember, I was saying most venture capital portfolios are only 20 to 40 companies. If you only get a big win 1% of the time out of 20 or 40 companies, guess how many that is? 0, motherfuckers! And so if you're really good, Benchmark and Sequoia and a few others, they probably pick unicorns at about a 5% rate. And that still makes it not so easy to get a big win if you only have 20 to 40 companies. So as it turns out for us, we're actually a little better than average. We probably get that 50x, that billion-dollar outcome about 2% of the time, although we're starting from seed stage, not Series A. If we look at our first 2 funds, about first 4 or 5 years, maybe 500 or 600 companies, about 1 out of 4 of our investments at accelerated seed stage will get to that Series A level. About half of that will get to the next Series B level, and about half of that will get to Series C, or we start to call them centaurs or $100 million plus companies. And it's those last 2 categories up there that we really see, that 2% and the 5%, that really generate most of our wins. Now, that's not really that exciting, right? If I tell you, hey, I've got this great new product, you can put down $100 and buy 100 lottery tickets, and 80 of those lottery tickets will result in a big fat 0. And 20 of those lottery tickets might win you $3, and maybe 5 of those lottery tickets win you $10 to $20, and you, sir, you might pick that wonderful 1 lottery ticket that's worth $100, but you got to wait 10 years. How many of you want to get a new car today? None of you motherfuckers. And the reality is venture capital is actually a pretty hard profession to make money. It's arguable that which is worse, entrepreneurs or venture capitalists, we both fail probably more than half of the time. We both do well maybe only 1/4 of the time. And probably most of us are not really that great, less than 10%. But if you do it at scale, there's some statistical predictability in getting those large outcomes. Thus, again, 500 startups. How do we think about what we're doing when we're investing? Well, we don't generally invest in people who just have a good idea. A lot of entrepreneurs come up to me and say, hey, what do you think of my idea? And I say, I don't give a fuck. I actually care about whether your customers think it's a good idea. In fact, I care about whether your customers think it's a good product. And how do I know that? Are your customers using your product? Are your customers buying your product? Are your customers telling other people about that product? Are they coming back again and buying a product? Are you making $1 on the product? Or does the product cost $1 and maybe you make $1 and a penny? Hey, I've got $1 million in revenue. Well, if it costs you $2 million to generate $1 million in revenue, that's not such a great product. And you aren't going to make that up in volume. But what we're looking for is you've gone from idea to functional product, and in our world we call that an MVP, or minimum viable product. And we want to see that not just does it work, but somebody cares whether it works. Somebody uses it, somebody pays for it, somebody paid for it more than once, somebody will tell their friends about it, right? So we're saying from initial concept to implementation, a lot of people don't get there. From implementation that functionally works to people actually using or paying for your product, a lot of people don't get there. And then from there, do a few people use it, and your mom doesn't count, but can you scale that up and get lots of people to pay for it? And are you paying less for that than you're actually generating? And how long does it take you to do that, right? And so these things are kind of basic. You're just trying to figure out, well, if I put $1 in, do I get more than $1 out? If I put $1 in now, do I get $1.20 out within 6 to 12 months? Do I get $2 back out? Okay, and so we build a model about that. And we try and build a belief that, okay, they've built something, people use it, it's kind of functionally making money, or at least it could make money, and then will it scale, right? And that's, when we decide to really start investing, and hopefully some other folks come after us, put money in after us. So when we got started, these were a lot of the concepts we had, but we weren't really sure. We hadn't done this for very much. Neither Christine or I had been really professional VCs. I'd done a little bit of work with Founders Fund for maybe a year and a half, but not much more than that. So, okay, we're going to make a company. We're going to build based on this lots of little bets. We're going to emphasize online marketing. We're going to probably do a lot of social media and promotion to promote ourselves and also to tell our companies how to promote. And we're going to try and build a community. And so this idea of 500 strong, we called the company 500 Startups, and we used the 500 number as kind of this branding element. But we really didn't come up with 500 strong. Actually, our community sort of came up with 500 strong. And in fact, some of that community wasn't even people we invested in. They're actually just people who liked what we were doing. And a lot of it was more about underdogs, people who maybe didn't go to Stanford and didn't go to Harvard and weren't PhDs and maybe grew up in Morgantown, West Virginia, or didn't go to the right schools to get into venture capital. And so there was a lot of things where we were kind of rooting for the underdog. We were betting on women. We were betting on minorities. We started betting on companies that were outside the US and other markets. And we were kind of surprised there were a lot of people who felt the same way. And so that was really where 500 Strong came from. We did a lot of things that were based on accelerator programs and based on seed funds, but I will say the most fun part about it was really just building a company that we wanted to be part of. And Christine had worked at Google and YouTube. I had worked at PayPal and done a little work with Facebook and some other folks. And those are really innovative companies, but they don't always let us have as much fun as we wanted to. And one of the most fun things that we got to do when we ran our own company was we got to write our own blog posts and our own press releases. And so we got to make up crazy stuff. We got to do press releases with headlines and copy that we wanted to do. I think one of our first announcements about one of our first accelerator classes, we put a couple of Muppets characters, I think it was Beaker and Professor Bunsen Burner, and we sort of said we discovered 2 new elements, and there's a picture of Beaker blowing something up in a lab, and it was just like a lot of fun. And this may not strike you as being something that you want to build a company around, but a lot of our company was built around having fun. We didn't have a lot of money. We didn't always know what we were doing. It wasn't very easy to recruit people in the Valley when they could go work for Facebook and Google and make a lot more money. They could certainly work for other venture capitalists that were more proven. But they couldn't work for anybody who was going to have more fucking fun than we did. And so that was our secret weapon. It was like, hey, we're up here. I'm dressed in flip-flops. I'm wearing pants today. This is actually a step up for me. Usually walking around the office in like shorts and T-shirts and it was really fun. I mean, it was a shit ton of work. There was a lot of things we didn't know, but that was our secret weapon, was really like we got to do what we wanted and we had fun. We worked our asses off, but, having fun was kind of the secret weapon. And, voting and rooting for underdogs and investing in underdogs and building that community and doing education, all those things kind of built on themselves. Now, there's a lot of things we probably didn't need to do all that stuff, but we wanted to do that stuff. one of the things that's hardest for us and been hardest for us is really the fundraising. We kind of came up with a model that was very unconventional. The rest of the industry wasn't generally doing that. Even Y Combinator and Techstars, which had started a little bit before us, were not really proven in 2010. We were people that hadn't gone to the right schools and hadn't done a lot of venture capital investing. We were geeky and we were kind of smart, but other than the fact that we had a job at Google and PayPal for a little while, we didn't really have much to sell on there. It took us the better part of that first year to raise our first $10 million. And I'd been in the Valley for 20 years, and I'd worked for companies like PayPal, and I'd made 50 or 60 angel investments, and it was still fucking hard. It took us another year to finish raising that fund, and still to this day, we're still proving out this story. We're still, we're getting great returns now from our first fund, and our second fund's looking good. But 7 years in, and people are still skeptical about a lot of things that we're doing. That's not true on the entrepreneur side. I think we've built a brand, we've built a sort of community and a following on the entrepreneur side, but the investor side's still been skeptical. Again, we didn't have a lot of money. We were kind of crazy. We didn't feel like that was a weakness. We turned that into a strength. A lot of the startups that we invested in, we kind of were a startup. We are a startup ourselves. I mean, we're probably a 7-year-old startup with now 150 people, and we have a $20, $25 million a year budget ourselves, but it didn't start out that way. And a lot of things were challenging in the beginning. A lot of startups knew that we were, running on a shoestring for the first few years, just like they were. I think we tried to tell our story. We tried to hustle hard, but we were also, kind of humble about some things, kind of bold about other things. That worked okay for us. On the actual functional side, I'm going to shift now and talk a little bit about how we construct our portfolio and how we think about it. But we kind of wanted to be differentiated. We don't always look like the rest of the venture capital community. Even in Silicon Valley, we look a little different. It's okay if some people hate us. It's okay if some people don't like us. But it is important that a few people love us, and that's like really, really, really important. There's a woman named Kathy Sierra who used to, write blogs and write a book called Creating Passionate Users. And she would talk about how the fact that, being hated is okay. Being loved is great, but being hated is okay too. It's indifference that is death. You do not want to be in the middle. Like, if people hate you, it's actually kind of closer to them loving you than not giving a fuck about you. If they're in the middle and they're indifferent, you're not going to learn anything about that. They're not going to tell you what is great or what sucks. People who love you, like, oh, you're awesome, I love you, you're so wonderful, kind of don't learn as much. People who hate you over here, you suck, this sucks, that sucks, this should be over here, this is bad, this is wrong. You get a lot of feedback from people who hate you. People who hate you actually, there's some reason that they hate you. They care about something going on there. So it's sort of like the absolute magnitude of emotion is really the test. People who hate you are closer to loving you than people who don't really care. I used to do customer service for a little bit with PayPal when I was there. I was helping with the developers, and I'm sure a few of you have been screwed over by PayPal at one point or another, but talking to those people, normally you forget your password, and people like, I want to know the password, and they'll send you one. PayPal, like, you forget your password, like, excuse me, could you send me your driver's license, your social security, your firstborn child, a pint of blood, and maybe, I don't know, like all that pornography you've been keeping on your computer for the last 10 years? And then we might give you your password. So PayPal had a lot of people that really did not like them. Amazingly, if you help those people solve their problem, they turned out to be some of the most passionate users and developers that helped us out. So I've seen that story turn around from hate to love. I'll talk a little bit more about our hacker, hipster, hustler, and the online platforms. But so hacker, engineers and developers, hipster, someone who does your design and user experience, and hustler, someone who grows a market or helps you raise money. And I just like to alliterate. That's really why I do this. But a lot of people emphasize just the coding component. People are like, I want my little girl to learn how to code. And I'm like, fuck you. I want my little girl to learn human psychology because I want her to be the CEO, not just the coder. But coding's really important. That was how I started out. I realized that design and user experience is also important. Unfortunately, I don't have that person for my slides, which is why you see Comic Sans fonts and a bunch of other colors. Maybe if any of you are going to help me with that, let me know. But then we really felt like the secret sauce, the magic, is this customer acquisition and scaling. And I was talking before about all these different online platforms, particularly search and social and mobile, and now visual platforms and messaging platforms. What's really amazing about that is just the ability to turn the dial on, turn the faucet on, and with the right content, pictures, product, applications, product will scale, right? Customers will scale. Like that's what's really kind of unique opportunity about the last decade or so, is the ability to have reach with millions, if not tens or hundreds of millions of people, and to dial it up with strategies that might cost you money or might be free, but don't require a linear increase in the number of people. So I don't need 100 salespeople to get 100 million people. Sometimes I can do that with online tools and methods. So that's really interesting and unique, and a lot of times the differentiator between small good companies and large good companies is more the customer acquisition techniques and the online marketing, not always the product. There's some folks in Silicon Valley who believe the product sells itself, and we certainly did a lot of viral marketing techniques at PayPal, but there's also great products that no one hears about because you don't do the right marketing. It's not always the case that word of mouth or online viral techniques are the only ways to spread that. So hacker, hipster, hustler, that's the Holy Trinity for startups. And then we started thinking about, well, how do we invest in a way that's sort of scalable and structured? And so we thought incubation, where you're really working on product, seed stage, where you're working on marketing and maybe understanding customer cost and metrics, and then venture, where you're really starting to scale. And I won't go over too much with all this, but we kind of try and go through those processes in a way that we filter out the failures and then keep reinvesting in the things that work. So stage one is really, can you build a functional prototype that works, and does someone use it? And again, we hope you kind of do this on your own dollar, not ours. We might do this at the accelerator stage, but we like to kind of take companies that have already figured this out. But the goal is to build this minimum viable product or something that people use, again, not your mom. And you can prove that you can get from idea to functional use case and people that care about it and maybe even pay you some money. At this stage, it's probably not a lot of money, but it might be 1 to 3 people. At the next stage, what we're really trying to do is not build as much on the functional product side, but really try and understand what are the metrics of the business and how can we grow. Can we scale this? What does it cost? What kind of revenue does it generate and when? Are the unit economics positive or are they trending positive? And can this be a big business? So not just can it make money, although that's sort of important, but will it be a scalable business? And hopefully a profitable business. And at this point, you might have seed stage or angel investors, might have a little bit more people. You try and build a model for how the cost inputs and the revenue outputs work. And you could do that on a bootstrap basis, you could do it on an equity basis, maybe on a debt basis if you have access to debt. But you're trying to build a financial equation for customers and the product that work. And a few of those will potentially be large companies also, and this is where venture comes in. So, okay, I've got a product, people like it, they'll pay for it, I might make some money, it looks like I can get a lot more of those customers. Hey, Mr. Venture Capitalist, will you give me $5 million? Okay, maybe. Boom. And then we start spending that money, not necessarily on hardware or software as we used to, but really on people to build the company and on customers, and maybe on product to some extent. But we're trying to use that money to scale the business and show that with $1 invested, we're going to generate $2, hopefully not too much later than maybe 6 to 12 months after that. And now, okay, we've got a roadmap for how we kind of scientifically, or at least a little bit smarter, build companies, provide capital, and get them to scale. And we know failure is going to happen, but we also know big wins are going to happen, maybe not a lot of time. And so now we start looking at, well, what's required to get those companies to those next stages? You have angel investors and maybe accelerators. You have seed stage capital. You have Series A capital. Maybe even you have access to later stage capital and IPO markets or exits. But it's those 3 stages that I've kind of circled there that are really important. The accelerator and angel capital, the seed stage capital, and Series A capital. Those periods, those companies, are not very big. They're not generating necessarily profits yet. They might have got some revenue, but they may not be profitable either on a unit basis or operationally. Those fund sizes are not very big. The venture capitalists who have to run those don't really make a lot of money doing that stuff. It takes a long time and they probably fail. It's much easier if you can raise a bigger fund to run a bigger fund. right? And so running a small fund or an accelerator is a labor of love. It's not something you're necessarily going to make a lot of money at right away. Investing in small startups is also very risky. And again, unless you're doing a lot of that, there's no predictability around that type of success. Right? So we see a lot of ecosystems, and whether those are in other countries or here in the US, where it's problematic to build that middle piece of that stack. There's a lot of people who can start companies out of basements and garages all over the world. There's starting to be a fair number of people who are putting accelerator capital. And then there's lots of people who do the late stage stuff. They'll do private equity or real estate or other big things. But that middle portion is where startups get a little bit more expensive and still hard. And that's where it's hard to build that. I'm going to wrap up a lot of this because it's getting a little bit too theoretical. But one thing I will say to you is a lot of people think that entrepreneurial talent is the limiting factor in growing startup ecosystems. I think that's generally wrong. It's usually a lack of access to capital. And from my perspective, I'll talk about equity capital. You could say debt capital might be equally as important. But an interesting stat is if you look at the number of venture capital firms per million people, the US leads the world. We've probably got 2 or more venture capital firms per million people. China, which is probably the other big startup ecosystem, over the last 20 years has gotten close to maybe 1 venture capital fund per every million people. And then, the UK and Europe, which you would think is a pretty developed market, actually isn't as far along as China is. And really just in the last few years has started to put together seed funds and a lot of other smaller venture capital firms. In other parts of the world, in Southeast Asia, in India, in Latin America, in Africa, I just took a bunch of investors to Africa for a 2-week trip through Nigeria, Ghana, and South Africa. It's far less than 1. In fact, it's barely 0.1 per million people. And so actually what turns out to be the case is, here's an interesting little story. US venture capital has taken the last 50 or 60 years to get started. It started really with a lot of defense spending and research as far back as the 40s, 50s, and 60s. The growth of the semiconductor market and eventually the hardware and software markets. But a lot of people don't know that the venture capital industry was heavily subsidized by the US government and by the Small Business Administration. Billions of dollars, tens of billions of dollars were spent by the US government, particularly through the small business environment, to basically support venture capitalists. And you would say to yourself, well, do venture capitalists really need money? Are they, sort of the people that need money? Why don't we just give it to the entrepreneurs? Well, yes, but it's not easy getting a venture capital fund off the ground. It's a high-risk business. It takes 7 to 10 years or more before you start seeing generated returns. And so with the Small Business Investment Act in 1958, with changes in mutual fund laws that allowed mutual funds and pension funds to start investing in venture capital, probably in the mid-70s, an explosion of venture capital started happening. Right? An explosion of businesses started happening in the 60s and 70s, and microprocessors, Fairchild, Intel, excuse me. All those businesses started coming out 60s and 70s. Venture capital firms started growing in 70s and 80s. And no surprise, we started having lots of tech company IPOs in the 80s and 90s. This was not coincidence. It wasn't like all of a sudden a bunch of people woke up and figured out how to do startups. It was because we'd been spending billions of dollars in defense market R&D and in putting into investment firms that would do high-risk capital with long cycle time on the return of that capital. It was a subsidized market. Venture capital is an entitlement program. It's about the same as Social Security and Medicare. You would not think that, right? You would think that venture capitalists, we're all about capitalism. We're all about making our own money. No, actually heavily subsidized by the US government to get off the ground. And I'll not bore you with this statistic anymore, but saying that, what's critical to these ecosystems, well, I will still say the most important thing is optimism and belief. Silicon Valley is really a crazy place. It's a bunch of insane people who all think that they're going to defy the odds. I often, we'll talk about my colleague Reid Hoffman would say that venture capital and entrepreneurship is kind of like someone jumping off a cliff and building the plane on the way down. Right? Or trying to put together a parachute on the way down. Now, I'm going to try not to kill myself when I do this. Hold on one second. All right, what happens if you jump off a cliff, try to build a plane on the way down? You fucking don't build a plane, you goddamn die! Most of the time you die. Every once in a while, one of the people jumping off that cliff is Elon Musk, and you jump into his plane, and maybe you do okay. I jumped into a plane called PayPal and made a little bit of money. Now, if you're the only person jumping off that cliff, yeah, that's a pretty fucking sad story. 10 people jump off a cliff together, probably you all still die, maybe one person left. 100 people jump off a cliff together, 5 or 10 of those people are going to figure it out. One of them is going to definitely figure it out. The collective insanity of Silicon Valley is that we all think we're the fucking winner. And probably we're mostly wrong, but some of us are right. And the success of Silicon Valley is that is a collective hallucination that we all do together. Entrepreneurs and venture capitalists, we're both shitty. We both fail most of the time. If we only did it by ourselves, it would be a terrible thing to do. If we all do it together, it's a fucking smart thing to do. It's an amazingly smart thing to do because we don't really die most of the time. We just fail. But the ones that succeed, those companies grow big. And that's why you have Silicon Valley. That's why it works. It's because we're all fucking crazy together. And gradually that insanity is spreading around the world. But you have to believe. You have to have that optimism. I'm a little bit fucking crazy. I kind of believe. Thank you.